Hello, everyone. A little check-in today because I made the mistake of watching the news. But a historian is always going to be looking at what's happening around them and trying to figure things out. It's what we do. So I hope for those of you that are in the United States right now that you're able to keep safe, calm. You're not freaking out too much. There will be a poetry reading in a moment, so that's exciting. I think I'm not going to watch CNN for the rest of the day. I think I'll just keep on my Twitter feed and see what's going on there. But it seems like the United States is the only place that's really on fire right now. But if anything's going crazy elsewhere, let us know. It's pretty mad out there. Though someone did write me that in Mexico things are bad as well, socially. So today I want to talk about monopolization of power. This is a favorite topic of mine. It's something I write about a lot, something I work on in class a lot. Power, I like to separate it up into 4 types. I've talked about this guy before. He's organized so many of my thoughts. Michael Mann, a social historian from University of California, San Diego. He wrote this book called The 4 Sources of Social Power. And he separates it into ideological, economic, military, and political. You guys have heard me talk about this before. And this power is monopolized particularly well for violence, military power if you like, but violent power, and economic power, power of the message, news. You're seeing a lot of discussions about what's true, what's not true, who's lying, who's spinning, what the truth is, where the truth comes from. But how does the state monopolize power, and how do people fight it when they feel angry, disenfranchised, exploited, and the resentments are just so much, as you see by watching the news, that it's just exploding into all kinds of violence. Well, when things are working and a state wants to maintain control, they monopolize violence. They're the only ones that are supposed to wield weapons. They're the only ones who are supposed to punish people. They're the ones that monopolize that in the body of the king in Egypt, in their police, in their army. In my country, in the United States, it's the enfranchised who have this monopolization of violence. It's more broadly construed. So violence is monopolized by the police and the army, but also by white Americans who are able to walk around with their AR-15s and they're not threatened by the police. But when you have people of color going out with weapons and less economic enfranchisement and more desperation and anger, then there is a pushback. So you can see the differences between people who are enfranchised and can hold weapons and people who are disenfranchised and cannot hold weapons. That's in the United States that I'm talking about right now. And one can imagine that in ancient Egypt is very much the same, but weapons for the disenfranchised, the hard thing to get your hands on a bronze weapon if you're a poor peasant. And this is why the revolution scenes that we see in movies or that you read about of disenfranchised peasants and people in urban spaces, they're holding up anything that can be used as a weapon because they don't have access to those high-level weapons that the state monopolizes and controls. And in a lot of the looting scenes that you're seeing on TV, you see people with weird makeshift weapons, with gardening tools, with all kinds of weird and wacky things, because the enfranchised have the nice weapons and the disenfranchised have other things. I'm not saying that they can't get weapons on a black market, but there seem to be a lot of creative uses of tools out there. I have to imagine the same kind of thing happened in the ancient Egyptian world. And I have some examples that I want to talk about. So if the state is monopolizing violence, the key means of seeing that in ancient Egypt that combines the ideology into it is the king smiting. The king holding an enemy by the hair, getting ready to smash that enemy on the head with a stone mace of some kind, and the enemy is completely vanquished. This is something that only the king gets to do. We used to think, we Egyptologists, that kind of smiting of the other, of the person that didn't belong in the center of an enfranchised Egypt, was only a depiction and was not reality, until such a vanquished enemy was actually found in skeletonized form in front of the Mut precinct, the goddess Mut at Karnak. This was discovered by archaeologist Betsy Bryan and bioarchaeologists Salima Ikram and Roxy Walker did the examination of the body. And this guy had his hands trussed and bound behind his back. He was on his knees. His kneecaps were completely blasted away. And he was held in that trussed position, and he was eventually, he was displayed and he was executed. And that body proves to Egyptologists that at least around 1580, 1590 BC, maybe a little later, that kind of violence was actually shown to people in a public way. So public exposure of violence is something that a state might want to show. In the ancient world, I think we're very much about expressing a distaste for public violence by the state because the optics of it aren't good. In the ancient world, the optics for the Egyptians, they understood that the optics weren't good either. And it's more of a depiction and less of a reification. But sometimes the state does show this force and this power. I think where both of our states, the United States and Egypt, show power more overtly, and the monopolization thereof, is as punishment that involves imprisonment, so that, in the United States, a politician can easily get elected by saying that he or she is going to imprison more people with harsher laws, and that the rule of law will be respected, and people often flock to this kind of a politician in the United States. In ancient Egypt, displaying punishment, the police helicopters are going crazy if you can hear that. So it's all perfect. Displaying punishment or potential punishment by the state today is, you see it. You see the paddy wagons. You see people saying that there's curfews. There's a curfew in Los Angeles tonight until 8 p.m., that the rule of law has to be respected. There's a lot of discussion of how people will be harshly punished for doing things. I mean, I will say, when you see desperate, angry, pissed off, disenfranchised people looting, and you see them going into a Walmart or a Target or a Starbucks or a private mom and pop owned store, and then people are saying, oh, this is horrible, look at what's happening, this is awful, this is awful. I mean, how many Wall Street traders were actually imprisoned for what they did in 2008 and all of the looting that they actually did? So remember that if you're enfranchised in a system and you're a looter, I mean, you're not going to call it looting, but it's the same kind of thing. Then you're just exploiting, or you're creating jobs or something. But when the disenfranchised, who are not a part of quote unquote respectable society, go out there and loot a Walmart or take a safe out of a jewelry store, the kinds of things that we've been seeing on the news in Los Angeles, then it's just outright looting, and the punishment for those things is harsher than any sort of so-called white collar crime. It's interesting that you see similar types of disassociations in ancient Egypt. For example, I study the Bronze Age collapse, and I study the Valley of the Kings. At the fall of the New Kingdom, and we're talking about the reign of Ramses IX to Ramses XI, there was a series of investigations, trials, and impalements of men who went into the Valley of the Kings in the Western necropolis and opened up tombs of the kings and other elites, opened up their burial chambers, took out their treasures, and sometimes set the coffins on fire, came back the next day to get all of the gold, and then ran away. These men were rounded up and tortured and interrogated to name names and to say what they had done, where they had stolen things from. And these men, from documents, were, from all we can see, impaled. That means that they're put on pointy spikes, or maybe not as pointy as we would like, right there at the rib cage, and then hell, just kind of sat there. It's like the crucifixion of ancient Egypt. They're just put out there, exposed, and it could take multiple days for somebody to die. So there is a display of somebody trying to go around the economic monopolization of power by the state. These tomb robbery papyri have all kinds of monopolization of the message in them, telling us through these papyri and through these investigations that these people are bad, they are wrong, they are immoral. And there's all this discussion of how these people did these horrible things to the gods of Egypt, to the god kings, taking out their coffins, treating the gods like nothing more than a piece of trash, and how dare they. And the monopolization of this message by the state, high priest of Amun, vizier, all kinds of other state actors, was so successful that it's taken Egyptologists a whole lot of time to figure out that the state was also responsible for systematic looting of the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. That it was the high priesthood of Amun and the vizier and the king's son of Cush and all kinds of other official state guys who went through, opened up the tomb of Ramses II, opened up the tomb of Amenhotep III, opened up all of these tombs except for Tutankhamun, because they didn't know about him and he was covered over by the building of the tomb of Ramses VI. And went through and took out all of those golden treasures and used them to fund their regime. But they treated the bodies with respect. And even though they stripped them of all of their golden and precious stone jewelry, they rewrapped them and reburied them with themselves in the burial place of the high priesthood of Amun family. And so we have seen the high priesthood as the moral actors, as the good men who kept the bodies of the king safe, who treated them with respect, when really they're engaged in the same exact activity of looting and recommodifying all of the treasures from the Valley of the Kings. So it's all the same behavior. It's just a question of the optics and the enfranchisement and the monopolization. So if the state can monopolize the message, the violence, the punishment, the economics, then they can do the exact same things, but they can make it a white collar thing and have it above the line. And anybody who then tries to subvert and go around and make it something that can benefit themselves on an individual level and do it on the quiet and go around the state, well, they will meet a horrible end, and it can if they're caught, and their punishment will be very, very different. I mean, you could make another analogy from the 80s and 90s, in which in the United States, the punishment for a person of color having crack cocaine was 10 times worse than the punishment for a white man holding regular powder cocaine. And one person is put in jail for an extensive period of time, and the other one just, a slap on the wrist, go on your way, do some community service, and you're good. And you see how people who are enfranchised and have money and who are a part of these monopolization systems can act in a society with impunity, and how those on the outside cannot. And it's so interesting that once somebody is looting on a trading floor, or looting by exploiting somebody and not paying them a living wage, or looting and the social inequality is crazy and over the top, but we don't see these things because it's happening in front of a computer screen, or it's happening by a scribe sitting down in the shade. It's happening in a way that seems clean. It seems intellectual. It seems sophisticated. But when you see people running pell-mell crazy-like into a Walmart and taking a whole bunch of shit, running out and setting shit on fire and just going nuts, one is super scary. It's frightening to me. What about my personal safety? How will I survive? Oh my goodness. I hear the police helicopters. I hear the sirens. LA is crazy right now. But then you don't see that the state itself the enfranchised are the ones that are capable of so much more violence, so much more big scale violence, so much more harsh punishment, so much more economic looting, and so much more warping of the message. So same kinds of things. Now, I wanted to read, I told you there would be poetry, so let's get some poetry out. This is the book that I want to read from today. Oxford World Classics, The Tale of Snoohi, and Other Ancient Egyptian Poems. And we will turn to the words of Nefertiti, This is discussing, the date of this text is highly disputed, but let's go put it into the Middle Kingdom, around 1800 BCE. That's fine. And let's read how the monopolizers, how the enfranchised represent the disenfranchised when they upend their status quo, when resentment and hatred spills over, when people are really upset by what they don't have. So here we have, and I'm on page 137 for those of you that want to follow along at home if you have this book. Every mouth is full of I want. All goodness has fled. The land is ruined, though laws are decreed against it. For destruction is what is done, and loss is what is found. And what is done is what is undone. A man's belongings have been taken from him and given to someone who is an outsider. I shall show you the Lord in sorrow and the outsider at peace. The man who did nothing helping himself, and the man who did something in want. With hatred, they will give something only to silence a mouth that speaks, and answer a phrase with an arm thrusting a stick and speaking back by killing. To the heart, spoken words seem like fire. What comes from the mouth cannot be endured. Shrunk is the land, many its controllers. It is bare, its taxes are great. Little is the grain, large is the measure, and it is poured out in rising amounts. The sun god separates himself from mankind. He will rise when it is time, but no one knows when midday occurs. No one can distinguish his shadow. No one's face is bright when he is glimpsed. No one's eyes are moist with water. He is in the sky, but like the moon. His time of nightfall will not stray, but his rays on the face are now a thing of the past. So when the disenfranchised rise up in this hatred, in this rage, then the people who are the enfranchised, who find a way to create a crackdown in the days after, will write about it with a foreboding, with a sense that if you go down this path and you give up the order and the control and you want the freedom and you exchange it, you will lose your safety and everything will be a disaster. Those who don't deserve things will take them. Those who worked hard for them will lose them. And this is the story that the state needs to tell. This is the monopolization of the message at the moment that we are in right now. So instead of looking at people in Philadelphia running into Walmarts to loot as much as they can and seeing that as decades of disenfranchisement and seething resentment and unemployment and rage, you look at it and you are afraid and you see animalistic behavior and you represent it as such, and you represent it as an immoral evil that must be cracked down upon. And that is the state's monopolization of the message, and you see it right and left and you see it everywhere. And I will leave this discussion. I have many more things to say, obviously, but I'll be back. But I'll leave it with this idea that when people talk about the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau, one of the things that you hear a lot, if you watch Ancient Aliens, if you like to troll around on the web and look for conspiracy theories, is that these pyramids were devices for energy, that they weren't burial places, that no trace of a burial was ever found inside of these great pyramids. And I think that authentic truth is always sexier and more interesting than any sort of conspiracy. But so you can have your Ancient Aliens idea and think of them as power devices, but I see them as the end result of a failure of state monopolization. It worked during the time of Khufu and Khafre and Menkaure. It worked up until the end of the 6th dynasty. And once that state monopolization of violence and economy and the message fails, then even the tombs of those god kings can be opened with impunity, their bodies and all of their funerary goods and treasures taken out, recommodified by the next regime that's trying to create their own power and by a whole bunch of other people. So we can try to control these things, but the state will always end up at some points in time failing. And then the state will use those time periods of decentralization and failure to rebuild itself. So I don't know if I'm giving a very positive message, the message that I will leave you with is when you see the looting, try not to dehumanize. Try to see it in a different way. Try when you see the homeless in the United States, instead of seeing them as animalistic drug users, lazy people, you can see them as an archaeologist would see the remnants of a homeless migration in the United States. And that's people who are opting out of a state exploitation that they have no control over as disenfranchised people who would rather numb out and engage in a street piracy. I mean, I could compare the homelessness of Los Angeles to the oasis pirates of the late New Kingdom. Look at all of this stuff through a different set of eyes. Try to understand it historically and try to understand it in terms of human social power and the monopolization thereof, and how we could perhaps find a mechanism of more equitably distributing this power and seeing people less through dehumanized eyes, whether they be police or looters, and through more human lenses of power and fear. So I leave it there until the next day. Let's hope tonight is not as hot as it was last night, and wherever you are, please stay safe.